What if love were only the reflection of something that died long ago? What if every face we adore were merely the echo of an ancient memory, shaped by a heart too tired of searching? And what if one morning we woke to discover that the person we lived for, and perhaps died a little for, never truly existed? Some questions are born in silence when the wind slips through the cracks of the past and whispers names no one remembers. Certain answers hide in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. And there are stories, like this one, that were never meant to be told yet insist on being heard, even at the cost of the storyteller's sanity. They say love is the most human of all feelings. But what happens when it goes beyond the human? When the heart falls for something that doesn't breathe, doesn't bleed, and yet feels more real than any touch? There is a boundary between longing and madness, between nostalgia and obsession. And once crossed, there is no return, only the abyss, and the voice that calls from within it. I always believed death took everything we were, but I learned in the worst way possible that it only takes the body. What remains keeps wandering, through the corners of the house, in the mirrors, inside the memories we swore we had forgotten. And sometimes, when we least expect it, what stayed behind finds a way to come back. There are places that seem to breathe as if time had stopped within them. The mansion on the hill was one of those places, immense, silent, draped in moss and secrets. They said no one stayed there for long, that the windows wept when the northern wind blew, and that the walls still whispered the name of someone who had never truly left. That was where it all began, or perhaps where it all ended, because every love story is, in some way, also a story of death. And every sweet memory carries within it a subtle poison, a touch of sadness no one dares to name. Perhaps because deep down, we know that to love is to lose oneself, and never be found again. What I am about to tell you is not a legend, not a fable. It is a memory, or what remains of one. Something I lived or dreamed or inherited from someone who came before me. It doesn't matter, because the line between real and imagined is thinner than the thread of a spider's web lit by dawn. And it was right there, between reality and delirium, that I found him. Or perhaps, he found me first. The memory smells of old wood, of rain falling on dry leaves, of candles burning in forgotten corridors. It all begins when the gate of the mansion opens, with a sound that feels like a sigh from someone who has waited too long. The world outside fades, and the air changes, thick, heavy, as if every molecule carried an untold story. The floor creaks beneath my feet, and each step seems to awaken sleeping ghosts. That house was not just a dwelling, it was a living organism. And I, an intruder. Yet something there was calling me. Something beyond curiosity. An ancient summons. A promise made before I was even born. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. Something watching me. Not with human eyes, but with the consciousness of something that existed beyond matter. And still I felt tenderness. As if the place itself recognized me. As if I were part of it. Even without knowing why, that was how the story of my love began. A love condemned from its first breath. An impossible love because the man who awaited me inside that house did not exist. There are places that seem to live outside of time, suspended between yesterday and never. The mansion on the hill was one of them, a scar of stone on the horizon. Its windows were blind eyes that still wept when the northern wind howled, and the roof, covered in lichens, seemed to breathe in silence. They said it was built by a man who vanished without a trace, and since then, the air around it had grown colder, even in the height of summer. But none of that stopped me. On the contrary, it was that living emptiness that drew me in. The road to the hill twisted between abandoned fields and crooked trees, as if even the path itself hesitated to lead me there. The sky was blanketed by clouds made of dust and memory, and the air had a metallic taste, as if time itself were rusting. Every step echoed inside me, the sounds more like recollections than noises. Rain began to fall, thin and slow, washing the world of color, turning everything to shades of silver and gray. When I reached the gate, I realized it wasn't locked. The chain hung loose as though someone had removed it moments before, or as if it had never been there at all. I pushed the cold, rusted iron, and it opened with a moan that rippled through the valley, a sound that felt like grief itself. For an instant, I thought I heard another sound, distant, a whisper calling my name. But the wind can play cruel games with those who are too alone. The garden was a labyrinth of dead leaves, wilted flowers, and broken statues. A woman of stone, her face turned downward, bore an expression of eternal sorrow. Silent birds perched upon the branches, motionless as if witnessing a ritual I couldn't yet understand. At the center stood a fountain without water, and around it markings on the ground as though someone still walked in circles there, night after night. A chill ran through me, but something deeper than fear made me go on. The main door gave way easily. The air that escaped was dense, ancient, as though it had been sealed away for decades. The wooden floor creaked beneath my steps, the sound echoing down hallways that seemed far too long. Everything appeared untouched, but there was dust only where one shouldn't look, high corners, mirror edges, never on the furniture. It was as if someone still lived there, as if they had simply stepped out and would return at any moment. The first room was a great hall, its high ceiling illuminated only by pale light filtering through misted stained glass. There were old portraits everywhere, each signed the same way in the bottom corner, A. Delmare. The same man, painted in different ages, young, mature, then old, his gaze lost in emptiness. In every painting, one identical detail, a silver ring with a blue stone on the left hand, a symbol of something I did not yet understand, but would dream about for many nights. I ran my fingers along one of the frames and felt the dust dissolve, as if it had never existed. For a heartbeat, I could swear the man's eyes followed me from within the painting, not my reflection, his. A gaze firm, melancholic, almost too human, and when I blinked, everything was normal again. Just the canvas, the dust, and the silence. There was something in that house that pulsed. Not sound, not movement. A presence. A slow, deep breathing, mingling with the rhythm of my own heart. With every step it became clearer. It wasn't a threat. It was a summons. I climbed the stairs, feeling guided rather than walking. The walls displayed portraits, landscapes, and scenes that seemed to move whenever I turned away. At the top, a corridor stretched into infinity, lit by unlit candelabras and windows that allowed in a faint bluish glow, like that of a dream. One door stood ajar, and inside the air was different, scented with lavender and sea salt. A book lay open on the desk, covered by a thin layer of dust, a quill dipped in dried ink beside it. The words on the page spoke of longing, loss, eternal love. And at the end of the final line, a name. Ilara. My heart quickened. Ilara. The same name written in the childhood diary I had once found at an antique market. Its blue cover faded, its pages yellowed. Back then I thought it mere coincidence. But there, in that house, the name sounded like a shattered mirror reflecting a destiny already written. It was as though someone had been waiting for me, as though everything had been prepared long before I arrived. Night fell slowly like a curtain of velvet, and with it came the sound. Soft footsteps upstairs where I knew no one should be, the creak of doors, the murmur of voices that did not exist. I opened a window to let in the air, but the wind brought only the scent of something ancient, and the undeniable feeling that someone stood behind me. I turned. Nothing. But in the reflection, I saw a shadow, tall, motionless at the far end of the room. I blinked. The shadow was gone. The mirror now showed only me and the void, yet the air still vibrated, as if the glass had captured something my eyes couldn't bear for long. In that moment, I understood that the silence of that house was not absence, it was presence. and for the first time I felt something beyond fear. I felt longing for someone I did not yet know. That night was the first when silence did not feel empty. There was a subterranean rhythm in the air, a deep breath that matched my own. I sat by the window and watched the garden below. The dry fountain, the crooked statues, the wind pushing dead leaves as if moving forgotten memories. The moonlight bathed everything in a pale glow, and for a brief moment the mansion seemed alive, as if it had just opened its eyes after a long sleep. Time broke into fragments, and I felt myself become part of that place, as if the world outside it had turned into a distant dream. I tried to sleep, but something kept me awake. It was as though someone whispered ancient stories near my ear, not in sound but in presence. A murmur made not of words but of intent. I closed my eyes, and I felt him. A light touch, almost a breath, upon my skin. No body, no form, only warmth. A warmth that pulsed from within, as if another heartbeat in rhythm with mine. The next morning, sunlight barely crossed the curtains. Hours moved slower in that place, as though time itself were an unwelcome guest. The house, however, was more than old. It was a capsule, a repository of memories that refused to die. Every room seemed to whisper a story, and somehow I felt they all belonged to me. I spent the day exploring the corridors, each step leading me deeper into that labyrinth of wood and silence. Behind a heavy tapestry, I found a narrow staircase that spiraled downward. It led to a damp cellar filled with the scent of mold and rust. There, I discovered a circular room with walls covered in ancient mirrors, stained and darkened by time. At its center stood a marble pedestal, and upon it, a music box, small and ornate, carved with flowers and moons. I turned the crank and a gentle melody began to play, a sad song, yet strangely familiar. As it echoed through the room, the mirrored walls began to tremble softly, and that was when I saw him for the first time, not with my eyes, but with something beyond them. A diffused shape, made of light and shadow, outlining the silhouette of a man. The same face from the portraits, though now younger, more ethereal, more alive. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel him. He was watching me, not with menace, but with a kind of tender recognition, as if both of us knew something our memories had not yet revealed. The melody faded, and with it his image vanished. The silence left behind was so dense it seemed to have weight, but within me something had changed. A bond had been created, invisible yet unbreakable, a thread that tied me to him, as if destiny had only just reconnected an ancient knot. In the days that followed, his presence grew stronger, in mirrors, on shiny surfaces, in the shadows along the staircase. It was as if he lived in every reflection, watching, accompanying me, but never as a threat. There was sweetness in his absence. There was love in the silence he left between one heartbeat and the next. At night, the melody would return, the song of the music box, coming from somewhere deep within the house. And when I heard it, the air grew warmer, my heart lighter and my solitude less painful. I began to speak to him, not aloud, but in thought. I told him about my days, about faint memories of a life before this one. And somehow I knew he answered, not with words, but with signs. Candles lighting themselves, doors opening softly, ancient perfumes drifting through the air again, small gestures that made me smile in the dark. One afternoon I found a portrait different from all the rest. Smaller, older, hidden behind a heavy curtain. It depicted a woman with dark hair and melancholy eyes dressed in pale tones. In the corner, the familiar signature, A. Delmer. But the name on the frame said something else. Ilara. My heart stopped for a moment. It was like looking into a mirror. The woman's face, the shape of the eyes, the curve of the lips, everything was identical to mine, as though someone had painted my portrait long before I was born. The feeling was overwhelming. A knot formed in my throat. I felt observed, not from outside, but from within the house itself. as if it recognized me somehow. And then, for the first time, I heard his voice, low, distant, made of wind and memory. It came from nowhere, and yet it was everywhere. He said only one word, returned. The sound was soft, but its impact crashed through me like a tide. Returned. As if I had been there before. As if he, the man in the portraits, the spirit in the air, knew this was not a meeting, but a repetition. The floor spun beneath me, and the weight of countless possible lives fell upon my shoulders. Night descended with a silent force, and the mansion lit itself from within. Candles flared to life one by one, as though an invisible ritual were being prepared. The mirror in the corridor reflected something beyond the present. Another time, another scene. A woman in an old dress walking those same halls. She was me, and yet not me. In her eyes lived the same wonder, the same love, the same fear. And when I looked closer, I saw him in the background, the silver ring glinting on his hand. The same man, the same one who did not exist. It was then that I understood. I hadn't entered a house. I had entered a living memory, an ancient story repeating itself, waiting for the moment it could finally end. And somehow, I was the missing key it had been waiting for. Tears fell, not from sadness but from recognition, as if every fiber of my being understood wordlessly that this love was not new. It was a return, a promise never fulfilled, a life interrupted seeking redemption through time. The wind blew through the cracks and the candles flickered like hearts about to confess a secret. I sat before the mirror, and there he was, not in body, but in presence. I felt his hand over mine, though nothing visible touched me. The contact was real, and for the first time I understood the impossible. I had fallen in love with a man who did not exist, and somehow, he loved me too. The following days passed like a continuous dream, without borders between night and morning. I no longer distinguished hours. Time seemed to breathe in rhythm with my heart, and the house followed each beat. Sometimes the clocks stopped. Sometimes they moved again on their own, marking hours that did not exist, and somehow I grew used to it, to the impossible, to the invisible, to him. I began to speak to the emptiness, and the emptiness replied, not always in words, but in signs. A perfume blooming from nowhere, the crack of a candle lighting itself, the soft touch of wind on my face even when the windows were closed. It was like a silent dance with the unknown, each gesture a conversation, each silence a confession. I started writing about him in a notebook I found in the highest room of the mansion. Its pages already contained faded words, written in handwriting that felt strangely familiar. Sentences about waiting, love, eternity, and regret. The name Adelmer appeared again and again, followed by dates that made no sense. 1849, 1862, 1895. The same name, repeated across different decades, as if time for him were only a broken line, a cracked mirror reflecting infinite fragments of the same soul. I felt him everywhere, but most strongly at night when the house sank into an almost sacred silence. The melody of the music box would play again on its own, and I knew he was near. It was our secret language, our way of existing within one another, even without form. And to the sound of that music, I closed my eyes and saw him with impossible clarity. His features, his calm expression, the gaze that seemed to pierce through centuries. There was love there, but also an ancient sorrow, a longing that had never found rest. And I felt part of that sorrow, as though I had once been the cause of it. Sometimes the house seemed to move around us. Doors that once opened onto corridors now revealed different halls. Mirrors showed landscapes that did not belong to that place. Flowered gardens under a golden sky, a woman walking at dusk, the same man waiting in the shade of a tree. It was as if the rooms changed shape according to my state of mind. When I longed for him, the mansion became light, warm, alive. But when fear took hold of me, everything darkened. The air grew dense, the portraits watched me, The shadows stretched long. The house was the mirror of a soul, and I no longer knew whether that soul was his or mine. One dawn I woke to the sound of the music box coming from downstairs. It was louder than before, more urgent. I went down barefoot, guided by the melody, and saw that every candle was lit. The great hall glowed like a sanctuary, and at its center hung the portrait of A. Del Mere, now altered. The painting seemed freshly made, the oils still wet, and where the eyes should have been, two dark stains stared back at me, as if he were trying to see through the canvas. The air vibrated and the music changed, slower now, deeper, like the thud of a distant heart. I felt a force pulling me toward the frame, and when I touched the molding, vertigo took me. For an instant, everything spun, walls, floor, sound, and I saw another time. A hall lit by lamplight, voices, laughter, people dancing in old-fashioned clothes. At the center, a woman, me, turning in the arms of a man. The same face, the same ring, the same gaze of a love already condemned. And then, everything went dark. I woke on the floor, the painting before me, but now it was blank. No trace, no color, only an empty surface, as if the story had been erased in front of my eyes. I ran through the halls calling his name, though I wasn't sure it was the right one. My voice echoed back to me, multiplied, distorted. Through the windows, the night looked darker than usual, and the wind struck the doors with a fury that bordered on despair. The house trembled, alive and distressed. I climbed to the room where the golden mirror awaited me. Its surface shone, and in it I saw myself, pale, trembling, eyes brimming. But behind me in the reflection he stood there, clearer than ever, his face drawn by candlelight, his eyes fixed on mine, his expression infinite tenderness. He reached out his hand, and without thinking, I did the same. For a brief moment I touched his skin through the glass, warm, living, real, but the mirror shattered, scattering the image into 1,000 shards. I fell to my knees, the music box sounding again, distant, sorrowful, like a farewell. That night, I understood something terrible. The more I loved him, the weaker the border between worlds became. Love brought him closer to me, but it also corrupted the balance between life and death. With every touch, every whisper, the house reacted like a fevered body. Cracks appeared in the walls, light leaked through seams, voices rose from within things. Love was bringing him back. But something, perhaps the house itself, demanded a price. The days that followed were a whirl of sensation. Sometimes I woke in rooms I didn't remember entering. Other times, the reflection in the mirror watched me with a few seconds' delay, as though my image and I were no longer the same person. I began to dream of the sea, black waves breaking over cliffs, and him, standing at the edge, hand outstretched, calling me. In the dream, I always took a step toward him, but the ground opened and I woke before I could reach him. One morning I found a letter on the desk. The handwriting was firm, masculine, scented faintly with lavender. The words were written in faded blue ink. If love is stronger than time, I will return. If forgetting is the punishment, let the beginning be eternal. But if you read this, Alara, know, the price of remembrance is the soul itself. I stared at those lines for hours, unable to decide whether it was a warning or a confession. The house seemed to listen to my thoughts, and a cold draft snuffed the room's candles. A tear slipped down. It tasted of salt, like the sea from my dreams. The same sea where he waited for me. The same sea where one day everything would end. In the cracked mirror, the reflection moved on its own, and the face watching me was no longer mine. From that night on, time stopped following any logic. Days and nights became the same fluid body, a continuous breath between waking and dream. I no longer ate, no longer slept, no longer existed outside the house. The mansion had swallowed me, and strangely I accepted being devoured. For within it, among the fissures of the walls and the perfume of dead flowers, he was with me. I began to hear his voice more often. It didn't come from any single point. It seemed to rise from the very air, as if each molecule carried an echo of his soul. Soft whispers, broken words, ancient promises. At times he called me by name, Ilara, and at the sound a shiver climbed my spine. It was not fear, it was recognition. As if that sound were the password to a world I had once inhabited. His presence grew sharper. I could feel his invisible body beside me when I lay down, the subtle weight on the mattress, a warmth that came from no flame. And though I could not see him fully, there were moments when his features revealed themselves, a shadow tracing the edge of a face, a reflection smiling from within the dimness, a breath too close to be imagined. I lived between love and madness, between faith and delirium, and each beat of my heart seemed to call him back into existence. One afternoon, I was drawn by a sound coming from the library. Pages were turning, though no one was there. The air smelled of old paper and scorched wood. On the central table a book lay open, a leather-bound journal, A. Delmare stamped in gold on the cover. The pages were filled with notes, drawings, fragments of thought. Strangest of all, among the inked words were others burned into the paper, as if marked by something fiery and invisible. I read the first lines and the world seemed to stop. She has returned. Each century fate finds a way to resume what was interrupted. I lost her when time broke, and ever since, we have wandered in mirrors. But now I can feel her. The veil is coming apart. My whole body trembled. It was like reading a letter written by a dream, and yet everything made sense. Each line crossed the borders of time and settled upon me, as if the words recognized their reader. I kept reading, fascinated and afraid. I vowed to the mirror I would not forget her, and the mirror cursed me. Who defies forgetting defies death itself. Since then, my soul has been trapped between reflections, living the same waiting 1,000 times. If she finds me, the cycle will close. But if she loves me again, the world will break. I shut the journal with shaking hands. The dry thud echoed through the library and a gust of wind blew out the candles. Darkness fell like a curtain. For an instant, the silence was absolute. Then a sharp crack, and the mirror in the corner began to vibrate. From it, a pale glow rose, as if the liquid surface had come alive. And there he was, clearer than ever. The same gaze, the same ancient sorrow. But something new rested upon his face. A kind of guilt. He didn't speak. He only watched me, as if searching for the courage I lacked. Then the floor shifted beneath my feet. The library spun, books tumbled from their shelves. The air filled with old voices, fragments of prayers, moans, laughter, screams. I shut my eyes and called his name, begging it to stop. And suddenly, everything ceased. Silence returned. But when I opened my eyes, the mirror was cracked, and on the other side, the reflection showed a scene that wasn't the present. There was fire, the same mansion wrapped in flames, and at the center, me, dressed in white, trying to reach him as the ceiling collapsed. The reflection looked like a memory, a visual confession of a past I had forgotten, an echo of a tragedy I did not remember, yet somehow it had left scars upon me. From that day on, I began to lose the notion of who I was. The mirrors showed different versions of my face, some aged, some far too young, and sometimes none of them looked back. I dreamed of lives that were not mine, of voices calling my name in languages I had never learned. The house seemed to laugh at my despair, groaning in its foundations, creaking as if vibrating with my fear. But even so, I loved him. And the more I loved him, the more real he became. His touch began to leave marks, small traces of warmth on my skin, like kisses burning through the veil between worlds. He surrounded me with tenderness and guilt, and I felt in every gesture an urgency, as though time were running out, as if something terrible were about to happen, and love were both a refuge and a sentence. One night I awoke to the sound of footsteps in the corridor, heavy measured steps climbing toward my room. I rose slowly, and when I touched the doorknob I realized the wood was warm, as though someone had just placed their hand there. I opened it. The corridor was empty, but the air trembled. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but inside my chest. A voice that wasn't his. It was cold, feminine, made of echoes. It said, "You no longer belong to life," and he never stopped belonging to death. The floor seemed to give way beneath me. The walls whispered, the portraits shifted, and despair climbed my body like a dark tide. I ran to the golden mirror, searching for him, and there he was, and on the other side, distant, his eyes full of tears. He was trying to speak, but his voice couldn't cross the glass. Only one word escaped, barely audible. Run. But I couldn't run. Not anymore. The house was part of me now, and love was the thread that bound me to it. I understood, even without understanding. The promise made centuries ago was being claimed. The love that united us was awakening forces that should have never been disturbed. The tower clock struck. 12 chimes, and with each one a new crack appeared in the mirrors of the house. Reality began to unravel, and in the reflection, I saw the impossible. My own body lying in bed, motionless, pale. While I, from the other side of the glass, watched everything. I no longer knew which side life was on. What is time, if not a mirror? I thought of that as I watched my still body, pale as wax. The image flickered like a weak flame, and for an instant, I felt I could cross the glass and touch myself. But the reflection dissolved, and the room fell into darkness. The mansion breathed with me, slow and deep like a tired heart. Every wall seemed alive, pulsing beneath the faint candlelight, as though waiting for something, or someone. His name echoed in my mind like a forgotten prayer. A. Delmare. Now that name was no longer just a man's. It was an anchor and a curse. In dreams, he called me beyond time, and I followed, even knowing that something within me was being lost with each step. Days, or perhaps weeks, passed as I wandered through the house. I felt no hunger, no thirst, only the relentless need to understand, to remember, to discover what had bound us and what had torn us apart. I began to find objects that whispered stories. A veil kept in a silver box, a ring with the blue stone I'd seen in the portraits, letters without address, all signed with the same name. The words were tender yet desperate, as if written by someone trying to stop the inevitable, and among them, one letter was different, written in trembling script. It was never meant to last. No love survives the boundary. But what is love, if not the insistence to remain, even when the world collapses? That letter seemed written for me, or perhaps for the woman I once was. The Ilara of long ago, who had burned with the house and remained trapped in his memory like a shadow caught in time. That night something changed. The air grew heavy and every candle went out at once, as though an older presence had entered the room. From downstairs came footsteps, slow, dragging, yet certain. I descended, heart pounding, and found the hall glowing with a strange light that came from neither fire nor moon. At the center, him. His form, more solid than ever, wrapped in a bluish aura, his eyes fixed on me, alive, intense, human. And for the first time I heard his voice clearly. It was deep, gentle, and melancholy, a voice carrying the weight of centuries. He said my name as though in prayer, Ilara. And when the sound touched the air, the entire house seemed to bow before him. The walls sighed, the stained glass quivered, and the wind ceased. I wanted to run to him, to touch him, to embrace him, but my feet were rooted to the floor. There was something in his eyes, a deep sorrow, a silent plea. Then he spoke again. You should not have returned. The words tore the air like blades. Before I could respond, he stepped back, and the light around him began to fade. The hall darkened, and a strong wind rose. I felt the house shift, its foundations trembling in protest. And then, the feminine voice returned. The same one as before, cold and distant. The promise was broken. Now both will pay the price. A metallic sound echoed, and the mirrors began to crack one by one, scattering reflections across the floor. In each fragment I saw small images, pieces of other lives, other deaths, other meetings between him and me. In one we danced in a golden hall, in another we embraced before a window covered in snow. And in all of them the ending was the same. Fire, always loss. I screamed his name, but he seemed far away, divided between dimensions. And then I realized, the house was not merely the stage of our love, it was the prison that held it. Every wall was a veil between worlds, and every mirror a cell of memory. He was trapped there not by choice but by love, for defying death and swearing he would wait for me forever. The words from the diary returned to me. If she loves me again, the world will break. That was when I finally understood. Our love was not simply rekindling the past, it was repeating it. And with each repetition, the house bled a little more. The balance between life and death unraveled, and time, that old cracked mirror, began to give way. For days, or what felt like eternity, I drifted between delirium and clarity. I woke in rooms I had never seen, heard voices calling my name through the corridors, some tender, others terrible. The mansion was no longer the same. The walls breathed, the floor pulsed, and the golden mirror showed scenes belonging to another era. I saw the woman I once was, myself, walking beside him, smiling, alive. And then again the fire. Always the fire. I began to understand that destiny was a cycle. That each time love tried to be reborn, something destroyed it. And that perhaps the true punishment was this: to relive the same love in different times, never to complete it. On a stormy night I found the original portrait, the one I thought had vanished. But now it was different. The paint was alive, pulsing, and the woman within it, I, had her eyes open, and they moved. They looked straight at me. From within the painting, I heard a whisper. Finish what was begun. The floor shook, and the candles lit themselves again. The music, the melody of the box began to play, slow, dragging, mournful. The air filled with golden light and dancing shadows. And he appeared again, closer, almost human. His gaze was the mirror of mine, love and fear intertwined. He came nearer, and for an instant time stopped. I reached for his hand, and when our fingers touched, the world collapsed. A scream echoed through the walls, rising from something that wasn't human. The windows shattered, the stained glass fell, and the house cried. Yes, cried, a high, deep, wounded sound, as if love itself were an open. When I woke, the mansion lay in ruins, mirrors broken, the floor blanketed in ash, the air still, as though time itself had stopped breathing. The diary of Adelmare lay open beside me, a new line written in fresh ink. She has returned, and now, the end begins once more. I didn't know if I was alive, or if what remained of me was only the echo of a love that never learned how to die. The ruin did not happen all at once. It began like a discreet fever, a tremor in the foundations, a dissonant note repeated until it became music. The house, which once breathed with me, began to breathe against me. The air filled with fine, almost sweet dust, smelling of burnt flowers. The clocks began ticking again, but out of rhythm, each insisting on its own time, as though the hours had split into hostile fragments. He could still be felt, but not as before. His nearness came like warmth on a cold night, like a candle burning in a damp room, and yet there was fatigue in his presence, an ancient exhaustion, longing for rest. Love persisted, but now it carried weight. The heart that once floated now sank slowly, like a stone thrown into a dark lake. And at the bottom of that lake, Something waved. The letters returned, no longer found in drawers or desks, but in the places the eye naturally wanders. On stair steps, inside shoes, on the saucer of an empty teacup. Each bore the same signature, the same promise rewritten in different hands, as if successive lifetimes had copied an ancient vow. The name at the end, A. Delmare, began to blur, the ink running. The face in the portraits, once identical, started to shift slightly. A sharper jaw here, a thinner mouth there. The blue stone of the ring no longer quite the same. It was like watching the unmaking of a figure built from overlapping memories. The cracks in the mirrors ceased to be lines of rupture and turned into maps. They formed trails, paths connecting surfaces, windows within windows, a spiral of reflections leading to an impossible center. And always at that center the same image. A woman with my face, a man whose features changed subtly, and a fire. More than fire, a reckoning. The heat in the reflection warmed the room, and the wooden frames creaked as though under unbearable weight. It was in the cellar, in that circle of mirrors that had first offered me a vision, that the truth began to rise. The stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, gave a hollow sound beneath mine, a light tap, almost a knock, and the central slab shifted. Beneath it lay a cavity the size of a chest, lidless, a cradle of stone containing objects wrapped in dark cloth. Inside, a hard-bound album, covered in faded leather, exhaling the scent of things that never see the light. Its pages held no portraits but fragments of paintings, pigment samples, formulas for making color from minerals and plants. Above all, there were signatures, tested, repeated, smudged, until one line became perfect. It was a workbook of identity. At the end, the notes abandoned art for something else: hypnosis, rituals of repetition, descriptions of how to preserve a memory until it took form. The house was the instrument, the mirrors, its nerves, the name, its mask. A. Delmare was not a man. He was a mold, a signature inherited and applied to different faces, a pattern designed to hold love the way one tries to hold water in their hands. The illusion endured only while there was someone willing to desire it. The revelation did not wound me. It burned like an ancient truth. The man I loved, the man for whom my heart broke its rhythm, had not been born of flesh but of a vow, a promise repeated so often it took shape. Each century reenacted it with new souls consumed by the same vertigo. In some retellings, the woman fled the house before the flames. In others, she embraced the fire as if embracing destiny. And in many, the house persisted alone, feeding on what remained: perfume, names, songs, rings. The objects in the vault were proof, letters whose words I had already read, but written by different hands, carvings depicting the same blue-stoned ring on woods from distant eras, newspaper clippings recounting identical tragedies under different names. The house had learned to tell its own story, and I, as before, allowed myself to be told by it. I climbed from the cellar feeling as though I carried a light burning inside my chest. The light of knowledge both illuminates and devours. Wherever it reaches, fairy tales vanish. The corridor received me with the murmur of ancient footsteps. The paintings quivered, their eyes oscillating between tenderness and reproach. In each, the blue stone looked heavier. The signature, more certain. The man, less distinct. The golden mirror returned a late reflection, as if choosing between versions of me. First, I saw myself as the woman in white dancing among lanterns, then as the figure frozen before the fire, finally as the one holding the album, realizing that the form of the beloved was clay-shaped by centuries of desire. Love survived the blow, but it changed nature. It was no longer blindness. It was choice. From then on, every approach of his carried two faces: comfort and demand. The warmth that once was shelter now came with a chill that followed immediately after. His touch left traces on my skin, and then a void so sharp it ached. The house responded like an irritated creature, doors slamming without wind, walls sweating old water, wood releasing a sweet, fermented scent like overripe fruit. An insistence on the same story demanded a sacrifice. The feminine voice returned, reciting its verdict. No new words were needed. It spoke the ancient liturgy of debts and broken promises. Its role had never been to love, only to maintain. Guardian of the ritual, protector of the mold. Something in her recognized me, not with affection, but with duty. The care of a jailer. Her presence closed around me. Windows refused the day. The garden lost depth and turned into a bad painting. The gate twisted distance into illusion and became forever unreachable. Only the upper floor remained. There, where the wind thinned and cobwebs drew constellations, the attic held a piece of furniture I hadn't noticed before. A shallow cabinet with a false back. Behind it, a frame without glass containing a single handwritten page. Not a letter, not a diary, a contract. An agreement made between a woman of many names and the house, that the memory of a love would be preserved at any cost, even if it required inventing a man. In exchange, the house would gain what every house that has burned desires most: permanence. That permanence would come through visitation, repetition, presence. Every century someone would be called, and in some eras, it was me. The turning point was not a sentence. It was a private surrender, realizing that to love the man who did not exist was to feed the machine that created him. Understanding that truth was like pulling a thorn that had been buried for centuries, the relief came laced with blood. The heart once chained to miracle found clarity in the cruelest idea of all. To free him, I would have to refuse my own desire. The house would not survive such an act. The mold would break. The promise, which fed on memory, would starve. The melody of the music box began again on its own, but it was no longer the same tune. There was a new measure, a pause between two notes, an invitation to rupture. In the corridor, the mirrors aligned, forming a column of reflections leading to the great hall. I descended. The candles lit one by one, unhurried. The air was clean of dust, as though prepared for a vigil. He appeared among the shimmering marble tiles. He came as always, on warmth before form, form before face. For a heartbeat, his features solidified, and on his left hand, the blue stone of the ring ignited the hall with a frozen sea's light. His tenderness was so absolute the body nearly gave way. The house waited. The mirrors held their breath. The ritual, hungry, opened its mouth. My gesture was small, a mere deviation of the hand, a refusal to touch, a single step backward when my whole body wanted to advance. No words, only a silence that said everything. No. That no. The guardian blew her windowless winds, and the hall filled with voices that belonged to no mouths. The house declared its hunger. The walls bent inward, as if ready to devour disobedience. He, the molded beloved, flickered between appearing and vanishing, between body and memory. It took a second to understand. Refusal freed and destroyed at once. The mold was breaking. Whatever was real in him, if anything, would have to survive the fire without enchantment's aid. In the far mirror, the old fire began again. But this time, one small, immense difference. In the reflection, the woman did not run into the flames. She turned toward the corridor and extended her hand into emptiness as if guiding someone unseen. The signature in the corner of the glass dissolved into dust. The blue stone went dark. The ring fell from the finger of no one and clinked against the real marble floor, not the reflection. The house responded with a roar of ancient wood. The ceiling, bearing the memory of the first collapse, claimed the second. There was no ritual now, only fury. The mirrors began to implode from the edges inward, like eyes tired of seeing. The air smelled of sea salt, not from pigment but from the outer world, where salt corrodes and preserves. The music stopped mid-note, and within that note, destiny fit perfectly. The turning point was complete when the album of identities caught fire without flame. Its letters turned to pale ash like warm snow. The contract upstairs tore itself diagonally, as if someone were rewriting the decision. What once demanded sacrifice now required choice. and the choice had already been made. The hall exhaled one last time before collapsing, and that breath brought something fragile yet immense. A trace of him that no longer belonged to the mold, smaller, stripped of miracles, closer to loss, and for that very reason, truer. The man who didn't exist had come nearer to existence by a thread, thin as the edge of a blade. Love dared to look upon that frailty. The house could not. The first tremor. The first crack in the ceiling was the warning. The second, the sentence. The third, the invitation. And when the fourth came, the entire night poured in, like an ocean spilling into a glass. The mansion was finally repeating its destiny, but not by the same script as before. There was no dance this time. There was decision. At the threshold between collapse and the silence that follows, the story took a deep breath and waited. The fire did not start in the curtains, nor in the chandeliers. It began inside the mirrors, as if the combustion of memory preceded that of wood. Images burned before objects. The past caught fire first, and when the past turned to ash, the present stood bare. What came next would no longer be a repetition. It would be a reckoning. The house, deprived of its nourishment, would fall. The guardian, deprived of her ritual, would fade. And love, deprived of its miracles, would have to decide whether it could exist without illusion. The night leaned over the hill like a hand covering the eyes of someone about to see, and down below in the still garden, the dry fountain seemed to hear the coming collapse, as if waiting for the first drop after a century of thirst. In the final moment before the rupture, something gleamed on the ballroom floor. A blue stone. The silence that followed the collapse was not the silence of death, but of waiting. The fire had consumed the past with a slowness that felt almost sacred, and what remained of the mansion was only the skeleton, twisted beams, melted mirrors, the bitter scent of burnt wood and sea salt. But amid the ashes, something was breathing. A faint sound, like the sigh of someone exhausted, yet still unwilling to let go of life. It was him. The ground around me was a tapestry of debris and charred memories. I walked among them barefoot, feeling the cold dust cling to my skin. Each step made the air tremble, and the house, or what was left of it, answered in echoes. On the scorched walls, shadows still lingered, frozen in place, as if the fire had chosen to preserve certain images, rather than destroy them. Among those silhouettes one stood apart, the shape of two bodies entwined, a gesture that was both love and farewell. His name hung in the air like a fractured spell. A. Delmare. I spoke it aloud, and the sound spread like wind through non-existent windows. Then, something moved within the smoke. A translucent form, made of mist and light, hovered above the ruins. It was him, stripped of the house, freed from the mold, sustained only by love and remembrance. Without the false body that time had given him, he seemed more human, and paradoxically, more real. I moved closer, slowly. His eyes, now stripped of any defined color, watched me with a tenderness that hurt to bear. There was no longer distance between us, but there was no ground either. Everything around us hung suspended between two worlds, neither matter nor dream. I felt it then. This was the edge, the point where love could finally rest, or be lost forever. He spoke, and his voice sounded like wind over water. You broke the cycle, but I still belong to the house, and the house belongs to what was promised. His words were not an accusation. They were truth. Love had freed us both from the spell, but it had left a crack in the fabric of the world. Behind us, something began to rebuild itself, not physically, but in memory. The ruins trembled, rearranging themselves like recollections refusing to die. And in the center of it, a presence began to grow. The Guardian. She emerged not as a figure, but as a shadow shaping itself from the air. Her edges flickered like trapped smoke. Her face was undefined, a succession of ancient, weary women. When she spoke, her voice came from every direction at once, as though the house itself were speaking through her. No love should live without a home, and no home should die with love still inside. The wind rose fiercely, and the ashes lifted, like black snow. Reality bent, and I felt the world sink once again. The ground vanished beneath my feet. Suddenly I was no longer among ruins, but inside the house, before the fire, unbroken, whole. The portraits gleamed, the stained glass scattered the light of dusk, and the melody from the music box played clean, untainted by melancholy. Everything had returned, but not as before. Now I could see the machinery behind the beauty, the gears of time straining to undo the end. The Guardian approached. She was tall, dressed in liquid shadows, and her eyes were mirrors. In them, I saw my reflection, and his, beside me, pale and fading. She raised her hand and spoke in a voice that allowed no reply. "One of you must remain." The world seemed to hold its breath. The house waited for the choice. One of us had to stay to keep the memory alive. The other, to go on into forgetting. If both of us left, love would vanish. If both stayed, the cycle would begin again. The only way to break the curse was to accept absence. I looked at him. He smiled, a smile that held 1,000 goodbyes. And then I understood. He had known all along. He knew I would have to set him free, even if it meant losing everything once more. "Love is not what holds you," he said. "It's what lets you go." His words tore through the air, and the house answered with a deep groan, as if it too could feel pain. The Guardian extended her hand, offering the ring with the blue stone. The gem pulsed, alive, like a heart outside the body. She whispered, "Whoever wears the ring shall remain." I held it between my fingers and the chill pierced through my skin. I looked at him. He shook his head slowly. His gaze said what his voice no longer could. "Don't choose love. Choose peace." But how do you choose peace when the heart still bleeds? The melody began again, this time rising from deep within the earth. The entire house pulsed with it, as if it were the final movement of an unfinished symphony. The windows opened on their own, and the wind scattered petals that hadn't existed for centuries. It was time collapsing into beauty. And in the midst of it, he began to fade, slowly like smoke losing shape. Each particle of him seemed to carry away a piece of me, love dissolving into the very air that had once created it. I wept, and my tears fell upon the ring. The stone flared with blinding light, not blue but white, almost golden. The fire, or perhaps light, rose around him, covering everything. The house cried out one last time, a sound so vast it made time tremble. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was outside. The hill stood empty. No trace of the mansion. Only the field, the wind, and the distant scent of lavender. The ring rested in my hand, cold, inert. But for a fleeting instant, I swore I felt an invisible touch on my fingers, as if he were still there, somewhere between folds of the world, watching. And within the wind, a faint voice whispered, "Now, love can sleep." I looked toward the horizon, and for the first time in a long while the sky was truly blue, without veils, without illusions, without mirrors. Reality, at last, had begun to breathe again. Yet within me, in a corner untouched by time, the melody still played, a soft, distant echo, reminding me that some loves need not exist to be eternal. Time went on, but not as before. The days felt made of glass, fragile, translucent, reflecting fragments of a past that no longer belonged to me. The mansion had vanished as if it had never been, and yet, sometimes at dawn, the wind carried the sound of a door opening somewhere far away. I lived alone in the small house at the foot of the hill, surrounded by the same fields where everything had begun. But the silence no longer frightened me. It was a silence that meant something, a silence inhabited. The ring, now dull, rested on the table beside the burned diary I'd saved from the ashes. Its pages were half unreadable, stained by soot and time, but one line remained clear, as if written only yesterday. True love doesn't wish to possess, it only wishes to remain, even when unseen. I read those words every morning, like someone praying without realizing it. There was a peace in them the world rarely offers. His presence no longer surrounded me as before. No footsteps, no shadows, no whispers. Yet sometimes when I closed my eyes, I felt a deep calm, a gentle warmth, as if the air itself embraced me. And I knew he was there, not as a ghost, but as part of what lives within us when we love beyond matter. The nearby village said I was the last living soul on that hill. Some spoke of shapes seen on foggy nights, of voices from above, of a lavender scent carried by no wind. Others believed the house was still there, invisible to ordinary eyes. I never tried to explain. Some mysteries are not meant to be proven, only felt. And deep down, I knew the mansion had not been destroyed. It had simply returned to where it was always meant to be, inside me. Time passed as seasons pass when they no longer surprise. Flowers grew again in the fields, moss covered the stones, and life followed the gentle rhythm of one who has learned not to fight fate. But something in me had changed. I no longer waited for the impossible. And yet, I lived in eternal company. Sometimes at dusk the sky took on the same blue hue as the stone of the ring. In those moments memory became almost tangible. The wind rose, the grass bent, and for an instant, The air seemed to tremble, as if a presence were trying to touch the world once more. And I, unafraid, closed my eyes and let my heart answer. Not in words, but in feeling. It was as if two souls exchanged a glance without eyes, a touch without hands. One night, during a quiet rain, I decided to walk to the top of the hill. The path was the same, though everything around it had changed. The trees grew crooked, reaching toward the sky like fingers in prayer. The wind carried a scent I recognized instantly: lavender, old wood, and sea salt. His scent. And when I reached the exact place where the mansion's gate had once stood, I saw something impossible. Beneath the rain, outlined by mist, the silhouette of the house shimmered, not solid, but made of light, as if time had left a memory, suspended in the air. I approached with a calm heart, without the desperation of before. I knew this was not a return, it was a farewell. The windows of the ghostly mansion glowed with golden light, and from within came the music. The same melody, now slow and tender, like a sigh fading into rest. Each note seemed to dissolve the weight of centuries, turning love into something that no longer hurt. I stepped inside, or perhaps it was the house that stepped into me. The corridors were empty, yet alive. The walls breathed a final relief. And in the great hall, the golden mirror, intact, clean, serene. I walked toward it and saw the reflection. Not the one I bear now, aged by time, but the one from before, young, dressed in white, smiling. Behind me, him, the man who doesn't exist. Not as a specter, but as perfect remembrance. He looked at me one last time with tenderness and acceptance, and when he reached out his hand, I understood. It wasn't an invitation. It was a blessing. I touched the mirror. Its surface was cold, yet it vibrated beneath my fingers. I closed my eyes and I saw everything. The centuries, the faces, the fires, the reunions, the goodbyes. Every version of us, dissolving into a single point of light. And then I understood the secret the house had kept for so long. Love was not the curse. It was the cure. But only when it ceased to be possession and became memory. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was empty. No reflection, no house, no music. Only the rain, falling softly, washing the ground clean. The ring, which I had left at home, now gleamed on my finger, as if it had found its way back on its own. And in the wind, a voice whispered, calm and distant, "Thank you for setting me free." I smiled, and the sound that left me was like the turning of a page. The rain ceased and the sky cleared, revealing a vast silver moon that lit the entire field. In that instant, I realized that nothing truly dies. It only changes form, and that impossible loves are, in truth, the only ones that never end. I walked home slowly, with the serenity of someone who has understood the mystery. The mansion did not follow me. I carried it within. It had become part of my blood, my breath, my soul. And the man who never existed in everything that still made me feel alive. With every sunrise, when the wind slipped through the window and the sun touched the ring on my finger, the stone reflected a flicker of blue, small, delicate, eternal. And in that light, I saw him, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as the very meaning of love itself, to keep existing, even after everything else is gone. There was a new stillness in the world, not the stillness of cemeteries, but of mornings before the first bird sings. Life had found its thread again, simple as bread and water, and my heart, though marked, had learned the rhythm of a gentler beat. The hill, now made only of wind and grass, kept the space where the impossible once happened. An altar with no image. Nothing stood there, and yet everything remained. She went down to the village on Thursdays, bought fruit, exchanged greetings, returned small, complete smiles. Some swore they had known the mansion. Others said it had never existed. The elders spoke of a painter with many names, the young of a legend to frighten children. She listened like someone collecting rain in bowls, not to prove, but to remember, that water has the gift of returning. In the house at the foot of the hill, she lived by clear routines. She woke with the light, opened the windows to the scent of the fields, warmed the water, and let the ring rest in the sun for a few minutes, as if stones too needed to awaken. In her notebook, she copied scattered phrases, fragments of a melody that now played within her, no longer dependent on old boxes. What had once been a pact had become habit. What had once been a wound had become a scar. And upon that scar, a garden grew. She learned to see without mirrors, and in learning she discovered that the world holds reflections that need no glass. Reflections of wind in the grass, of the sky in a dog's eyes, of the moon in the puddles left by rain. Each reflection a kind of wave, not a longing that binds, but a longing that blesses. The blue stone, when touched in the morning, gleamed for an instant, brief, almost bashful. And it was enough. It was like lighting a candle in a vast temple, a small flame, an immense meaning. Time, once shattered into hostile fragments, had become a river again. Not the river that drags, but the one that carries. In its bed, memory settled like a polished stone, rounded by the friction of what had passed. Memory had weight, and yet it floated. It could be carried in the pocket of a dress, in the fold of a handkerchief, in that small corner of the body that resists forgetting. That fragment of us that does not change when everything else does. Some nights brought winds of lavender. On those nights, she placed the ring on the table and left the window open. She expected nothing. She simply allowed. And the world, when allowed, sometimes answers. The answer came without tricks, a deeper calm, the certainty of being exactly where life wanted her to be, the sense that someone was passing through the corridor like one walking through clear water. It wasn't a presence to fear. It was a nameless companionship. The epilogue of love is not a final word. It's a room with unlocked doors. In one, she saw the past as one sees the sea from a cliff, vast, bright, unreachable. In another, she glimpsed what she would never live, possible scenes that never became ours. In a third, she found only her own face, peaceful. She chose to remain in that one. Inside it, the questions that had once been blades now rested like shells at the bottom of an aquarium, still beautiful, but no longer sharp. The hill changed color with the seasons, and with each change, something in her grew lighter. The place where the mansion had rested, or existed, or remembered, remained empty and full at once. Sometimes children ran up and played there. Unaware, they danced above the old vestibule. Sometimes lovers spread blankets and shared fruit where once stood the hall of mirrors. The world, generous, reclaimed the space. She let it. It was not desecration. It was blessing. Where once love had begged for a body, now the body had learned to be loving toward the world. One day, the rain threatened, but never came. In the still air, the fig tree's leaves whispered like a restrained audience. She walked to the top of the hill and sat where the gate had once sighed like a weary chest. With eyes closed, she wandered through the house within, like one reciting an ancient prayer, the vestibule, the staircase, the library, the room beneath the roof, the round cellar, the dry fountain, the stone woman with her face to the ground, all of it intact in the country of memory. And yet all of it now light. Memory, once heavy as a chain, now fit in the palm of a hand. She thought of the man who never existed. And in thinking, she sought no face. She thought of the gesture, the way his presence had wrapped her in warmth, the way his silence had shared space with hers without contest, the moment when tenderness became choice, no longer miracle, no longer ritual, just choice. And in that thought she understood. Love was not the repeated spell. It was the repeated choice. The house, in the end, had not known this. That was why it burned. But what the house had not known, the world did. That is why the world opens doors when someone lets go. The hours that followed were simple. Bread toasted in the oven, tea brewed from leaves she'd gathered herself, a book open on the table, and the light leaning over the pages as if bending down to listen. The ring shimmered once, then rested. Outside, the field seemed to breathe in rhythm with her chest. Life had aligned itself. There was no omen, no sign. When night came, it came simply as night. That intelligence of the ordinary was her greatest miracle. Sometimes in dreams she returned to the golden mirror. This time, the surface showed no fire, no dances, no layered versions of herself. It showed a dirt path linking the foot of the hill to the top. No house at the end. And in the sky, a shade of blue so like the stone that she smiled in her sleep. She awoke with the sense of having walked, without hurry along a road with no destination. And that was enough. The village, which collected stories like seeds, reshaped hers to fit the ears of new generations. In some versions, she was the eternal bride, keeper of a ring she had never chosen. In others, the lady who spoke to the wind. In a few, the truest ones, she appeared as the woman who returned a man to death and herself to life. Most stories spoke more of the house than of love. She corrected no one. She knew that houses like to star in the tales of what they shelter. One summer afternoon, she felt the urge to write what she had never said. Not letters, not diaries, not promises, just a trace. She sat at the table, touched the ring, and let her hand guide her. She wrote no names, no dates, no vows. Only this, that love, to be eternal, must accept the shape of memory. That memory, to stay healthy, must accept the light of day. And that the light of day, to avoid blinding, must know when to set. She folded the page, placed it in a book about the sea, and returned the book to the shelf. Not for someone to find, but simply so it would exist. When autumn came, it brought a precision to the air, as if everything had been gently adjusted. The gravel paths sounded crisp beneath her steps. The shadows fell in perfect measure, and the crickets turned the night into a tapestry of sound. One evening from far away, a song came with the wind, not from the music box, perhaps a radio, perhaps someone's voice. And for a moment, life and memory sang in the same key. It was just a moment, and it was enough. In the deepest place, where the body meets its own silence, she knew no cycle needed to begin again. She knew that promises are rivers. When dammed, they rot. When allowed to flow, they nourish. The old promise at last had found the sea. In it, the man who never existed dissolved like salt. He left no body. He left a taste. All water carries something it has touched. All love carries something it has freed. And so, time closed its curve without a sound. The hill, once a mansion, became landscape, and finally, a habit of sight. The secret title of her life, the one no one reads, but every gesture suggests, now said, she learned to love what doesn't need to return. And when night falls and the blue stone decides to glimmer, it is only the world remembering that eternity prefers what is subtle. If anyone were ever to ask her, how does the story end? She might not answer with words, but with the calm of someone walking beside a field after rain. Because stories don't end. They take on a kind of silence that only hands understand when they rest upon the day. The love she lived, the love of the man who doesn't exist, was no less real for lacking a body. It had a home, yes. First, the temporary house of mirrors, and later, the true house of remembrance. The first burned, the second remains. When dawn finally pressed its face to the window and life gathered its quiet again, she fell asleep with the simplest certainty in the world, that there would be another morning. And in that morning, the light would touch the ring, and the faint reflection, for 1 second only, would say everything that needed to be said. It would not be a calling, nor a warning, nor a promise. It would be recognition. And so, in the space between one blink and the next, what once seemed impossible was explained at last. She fell in love with a man who doesn't exist, and in doing so, she learned to exist better. Because some loves do not ask for presence, they ask for persistence. And persistence is sometimes only this: a stone that glows a brief blue, and in that briefness keeps the infinite.